welcome to this video. Just intending to give you a little bit of help with your exam questions, or your first set of exam questions for the living world topic. I'm just going to go through each of the questions and just give you a few hints of the sorts of things you might want to do for those questions. So remember that you've got to write your answers in the box and email this back to your geography teacher if you can. Failing that, to write your answers down on a bit of paper and photograph it and send it to them, but just find some way of getting it back to your geography teacher. So for the first question, we've got a diagram here which shows a food web for a small scale ecosystem in the UK. We can see the different levels of that food chain or that food web. And question asks you, using figure 6, which one of the following statements is true? So you need to have a look at those statements. I'm not going to tell you the answer, but have a look at those and see which of those is true, and then write a Y or whatever. One of those boxes only one of those statements is true. Second question, suggest what would happen in the food web, shown in figure 6, if foxes became extinct. So if we go back up here and have a look, you can see that foxes are at the top of that food chain. You want to then think about, well, what would happen to things further down that if we removed foxes from that ecosystem? What might happen to moles or rabbits or beetles or plants as a result of that? Notice that it's 2 marks, so you want to try and say 2 points about what would happen. So think about 2 things or 1 thing, and then a knock-on effect of that in terms of what would happen if we remove foxes from the ecosystem. Question 3, or 2.3, state 1 role of decomposers in an ecosystem. So 1 mark, nice and straightforward. 1 thing that decomposers are doing. What is their job within an ecosystem? Next question, study figure 7, a graph showing the biomass at different levels of a food chain. Now, biomass, it says down here, is the total quantity or weight of organisms in a given area. So if, for example, we went to a forest, we might have 100,000 leaves on the trees. We might have 12,000 caterpillars. We might have 300 small birds, and we might have 1 sparrowhawk, for example. So we can see that those numbers are different depending on the ecosystem, depending on the organism or its position within that food chain or that food web. So your question firstly starts off asking you to calculate the percentage loss in biomass between the primary consumer and secondary consumer levels. So we want to know how much has this decreased by from the primary consumer, which is the caterpillar, to the secondary consumer level, which is the small bird. So we want to know what that decrease is. So you have to work that out first, the difference between 12,000 and 300. Work out that difference as a percentage of the original number. It's a little clue for you to help you work out that. And one of your answers will be one of these answers here. If it's not, you've done something wrong. The next question also relates to that food chain, and it asks you to give 2 reasons why biomass changes between each level in the food chain. So we can see those numbers are decreasing: 100,000 leaves, 12,000 caterpillars, 300 birds, 100 big bird. 1 big bird. Why is that number decreasing? We can see the numbers decreasing. I want you to think about why that is. Why do we have fewer birds than we do caterpillars? Why do we have fewer caterpillars than we do leaves on the trees? So think about what is happening to those organisms. Think about what's happening to the energy maybe being transferred along that food chain. That should help you to think of a couple of reasons for that question. And then to finish off with slightly longer question. So this is a 6-mark question. And it says, using a named example, explain how changes can have short-term and long-term effects on an ecosystem. Okay. So we've given you a little structure strip to help you. So you can use that as a sort of framework for your answer. And we've said here, don't forget to be specific to your chosen named place in every paragraph. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a a location, that could be a particular type of ecosystem. So possibly if you've studied a pond ecosystem or a forest ecosystem or something, then you could use some examples from that. You want to start by having a think about those changes, and broadly within your answer, you want to do these two things. You want to identify a change in the short term and in the long term. Okay, so you want to think about how might something change an ecosystem in the short term, and how might it change it in the long term. You want to think about doing that for a couple of different changes. Now, those changes could be human, they could be physical, so natural changes. So that might be a way of splitting up your answer, having one natural change to an ecosystem like drought or flooding, and one human change to an ecosystem like climate change or deforestation, and thinking about the impact of those changes on the ecosystem. What will happen to particular species of plants or animals as a result of that change? So hopefully that gives you some pointers for those questions. Make sure that you fill your answers in on this sheet and send that back to your teacher by the deadline.